Hello, hello. Welcome, everyone. So nice to see everyone. Thank you so much for joining. This is the first GIS After Dark for the fall term. And I want to welcome you guys all here. I see everyone's filing in. So we're going to go ahead and get started. We have an action-packed presentation for today. So again, you are joining GIS After Dark. This series is hosted by the Johns Hopkins University AAP Geographic Information Systems Programs. My name is Dr. Cassandra Hansen, and I'm the program coordinator for GIS and Environmental Science and Policy. And I see many students on here, so I want to welcome my students for showing up tonight. Thank you, thank you. Nice to see all your wonderful faces. We designed this speaker series to highlight the amazing work that industry GIS professional, JHU students and alumni are doing in the field of GIS. So our presenter today is Amanda Miner, and she's a Johns Hopkins GIS alumni, and she's coming to us from Envicom Corporation. And we'll save all the questions towards the end of the presentation. So at that period of time, I encourage you to unmute your mic. If you feel comfortable turning on your video, turn on your video, ask your own question. If you want to put your question in the chat box, I'm more than happy to ask that question for you. So before we get started, I'm always curious to see where everyone is joining us from tonight. So if you could just go ahead and in the chat box, put the state that you're joining from. If you feel comfortable putting the city, put the country. We're definitely an international group here. So go ahead and feel free to put that in the chat box. Excellent. Madison, New York, San Francisco, Boston. Excellent. Ooh, look at, yay, hooray. Florida and North Carolina and Germany. Excellent. Well, welcome everyone. Looks like we have a nice diverse group from all around the world. Welcome, welcome. I would also like to launch a poll just to get an idea of your familiarity with GIS. Are you a professional in the field? Is this your first time hearing about GIS? So go ahead and answer the first question. Who's in our audience this evening? So it looks like we have Hopkins students, we got some alumni, future students perhaps, general audience. Welcome everyone. Thank you, thank you. So let's give you a couple more seconds there to enter your answer. Great, looks like we have a nice group. And then the second question, so I'm gonna hit end here. The second question is, what's your familiarity of GIS? And so are you familiar with GIS? Have you used it before? Or is this a new concept for you? So feel free to go ahead and write that in the chat window. Is this new? Are you a GIS student or are you a GIS professional? So lots of engaging activities for this session here. So if you are new to GIS, okay, we have some professionals in the field. We have some folks that have never heard of GIS before. Are you new to GIS? New, excellent, excellent, excellent. There we go. We launched the second poll here. So you can feel free to go ahead and respond in the poll. Excellent, GIS professionals, familiar. So we have a nice group of folks here that looks like we'll be able to talk about GIS and apply it towards how it's being used in the field. So perfect, a couple more seconds to enter your information. Perfect. Well, welcome everyone. Well, let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to end the poll here, close it down. And so for today's topic, we're going to be talking about tools and how to measure complicated observations. So our planet is changing. The numbers are undeniable. Our planet is warming and the impacts are profound. Scientists agree that human impacts, including climate change, habitat destruction, and resource consumption, are threatening the health of our natural systems upon which we all depend for our long-term well-being. Climate and sustainability issues are complex and their impacts are far-reaching. And they're also difficult to grasp and even more challenging to summarize and then think of it as trying to quantify and map. Climate change over the next 10 years will negatively impact water supply for approximately 5.1 billion people, with water quality and affordability most at risk. Climate change is exacerbating economic inequality, and we're seeing that here. And we'll see that at-risk communities are going to be more vulnerable. So how do we identify who is at risk? What's out there? So like I mentioned, 5.1 billion people live in regions of the world that are likely to face high to moderate to high climate risks over the next 10 years. Climate change impacts will affect our water ecosystem. So how do we track our resources? How do we quantify the spatial component and identify the vulnerable and at-risk communities before drought, famine, and flooding becomes an emergency? So in the next 10 years, these anticipated large-scale changes will lead to a range of outcomes that directly and indirectly are affecting water supplies, including increasing frequency and severity of droughts, increased likelihood of flooding, which can contaminate raw water supplies and destroy threatened and our infrastructure. And then also the frequency of severe storms like hurricane, which can pollute raw water supplies and damage the infrastructure. So what tools do we have out there to answer the what, the when, the why, the how of this global problem? So in comes our geographic information system, or otherwise known as GIS, that allow for us to capture, collect, and process the geospatial information in simple maps and apps. So we all want to represent what is known in an overall goal of any GIS professional through the use of data collection, analysis, map creation, and apps. And we always want to know the what, the when, the where, the how in our geospatial world. And so we've seen how GIS has been leveraged as a powerful data visualization and analysis tool for making decisions based on science and facts that have real world consequences. Over the last year and a half, we've seen the power and spatial reach of GIS with the Johns Hopkins COVID dashboard. And we've all observed the global impacts of this virus but using GIS, we've been able to monitor, display, and share critical information on a global scale. So thus brings us to humanitarian GIS. Humanitarian GIS is a specialty service from Envicom, which provides geospatial solutions for the importance of building capacity within local communities. So problems to be able to identify, analyze, and quantify is disaster response, population and settlement density, predictive modeling for risk assessment, just to name a few. So today we'll hear and see through demonstrations how humanitarian GIS from Envicom are working with the Safe Water Network Group in efforts to provide cutting-edge safe water resilient toolkits using GIS to plan, prepare, and respond before drought and flooding becomes an emergency. So it is my honor to introduce Amanda Miner, who is GIS Service Manager at Envicom Corporation. As I mentioned before, she is a Hopkins GIS alumni. She graduated from the program in 2015. And so she's here to share with us her amazing slide deck of her tools that she's been developing over the years, and then also demonstrating these tools at work. So I'm going to stop and I'm going to turn over the sharing capabilities to Amanda. So if we can just go ahead and give her a virtual round of applause and welcome her. And I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to you, Amanda.
All right. Thank you, Cassie. Appreciate it. All right. So I'm going to launch my slide set here. So yeah. So we starting from the beginning, a lot of the teams that I work with are trying to get what we term safe water to everybody, the planet, everybody in the world. And obviously there are places where that's harder to do. So most of my projects are in Africa, and trying to implement technology in Africa is a challenge in and of itself. But one of the projects that we've started working on is the Safe Water Resilience Toolkit. As we've worked with groups, and a lot of the groups that we work with are safe water enterprises, which means that it's run as a business, it's trying to be sustainable, it's not just installing pumps and then they break 2 years later. They are in it for the long haul. They are a utility service provider that they get some kind of payment from communities. So being able to make that sustainable and for the long haul, they need to be able to identify and mitigate risk amongst a few other things, as we'll look at. So this is an overview of the Safe Water Resilience Toolkit. There's a landing page. A lot of these are still mock-ups, by the way. We do have them partially developed, but it's just easier to show them as the graphic layouts for right now. So basically, it will take them through a planning process. There's a lack of planning tools in the water sector. Everybody who's working toward SDG 6, which is getting safe water and sanitation. And so what we wanted to do was we saw a pattern as we worked with these groups. We work with about 6 different teams in about 5 different countries right now. And so there was a pattern to how they do their work. And so we were like, okay, they're doing a lot of this stuff in a very old school way. Can we mimic their workflow? And so what you're seeing right here is a series of 5 tools that mimics their workflow. They do basically a site suitability analysis that they call a feasibility analysis. Then we've implemented a risk assessment tool for them to analyze the risk factors involved in the place they work. Then the EPANET, that is a open source safe water network design tool from the EPA, the US government EPA. It's open source, it's free. And what we've done is we've built it into our GIS, our web GIS system. It's then comes mitigation, because if you've got risk, you've got to figure out how you're going to mitigate for that risk, because there's going to be risk no matter where you work. It's just you do have a choice where you're going to work and avoid the risk, but you can't avoid everything. So there's certain things you're going to have to mitigate. And then the last thing that they do is they have teams go into the field and actually do field sales, because again, it is a business. So that's what keeps it sustainable. And so those are the 5 tools that are involved. And so I'm going to go through the reasons why we did the tools, how they were doing it before, and what the tool does to help them a little bit differently. So their former methods were they would do a desk review of available literature. They would physically visit local government authorities. They would physically visit every community, not even the one that because they don't know anything about any of the communities. There's no data available. So they would have to have boots on the ground in all these locations. Completely inefficient, completely cost, not very sustainable cost wise. It used a lot of their budget that could have been used for more water infrastructure. So they were doing it on paper forms and paper maps. Imagine trying to translate that into something when you're going to multiple communities and regions. And then they would do a manual analysis of the results. So the challenges that they've told me about, these are the biggest challenges: non-existent data, inaccurate data. A lot of the times they're interviewing local people and they're giving them incorrect information. It's difficult to collect, it's resource intensive, and it's limited integration of variables is what they told me. It's very hard for them to assimilate all of this information, and so they just kind of pick the top couple of things. So their feasibility criteria, this is how they assess where they're going to work. The main things are combined population. So they figure out the population of a community in a surrounding neighborhood. These teams work in rural or peri-urban areas. So they're trying to address where the major shortage is. They want to know about existing drinking water sources. Are there already existing infrastructure in the area? Road accessibility. This is actually a big one because of having to bring in the borehole equipment. So one of the things they want to know is, are there all-season roads? And that's another SDG actually of whether there is all-season road access to communities, because in the midst of a flood that cuts people off and you can't get in, and you certainly can't bring in a borehole that's going to just get stuck in the mud. And then the other one is access to electricity, because they have, you know, pumps and other things that are part of the system. So, and then you'll see on the right, there's a ranking. So this is the order of importance. 3 is the highest value. And so this is what they had. This is where they started. There's some additional criteria that they sort of pay attention to. We actually integrated this into the tool, was people's ability to pay. So we looked at data like poverty, you know, GDP, improved housing, things like that, to just get an idea. There's not very good poverty data out there. We've been discussing this actually with Facebook, because they're the only ones who have really tried to create some comprehensive data on that. Priority for water access improvement. So that's something that is part of a planning process that each local government goes through. And so they will discuss with them where where that lies in their planning. Do they want water access improvements in their area? Is the area served by a competitor? Ghana Water Company, in this particular instance, the team we work with works in Ghana and India. And so they want to know, is Ghana Water Company already working in this area? Because they're probably not going to prioritize that area to do that. Proximity to markets where they can advertise and sell, and then existing infrastructure, which is similar to whether it's served by a competitor or not. So as I said, everything's manual the way that it's been done so far. So how do we do this in GIS? How do we figure out what the combined population is? So what we had to do is we happen to have footprints of every settlement area. That data is out there. CSIN from I forget the Columbia University, I blanked for a second. They have a settlement footprint layer, and also a group called World Pop have settlement footprint layers too. And they also have really, really detailed population data. So each one of these tiny little communities right here has population data attached to it. So this is like satellite remote sensing imagery, and along with a lot of statistics and integrating a lot of different data sources to try and get comprehensive population data, which in and of itself is a huge challenge. A lot of modeling goes on to get that. So what we had to do was make a 4-kilometer buffer around every single community, and then add up all of the community population within each one in how they do their parameters. This is how they were doing it before. And you can imagine how challenging that would be to rank those with the level of the quality of data that they were getting before. It's a pretty tall order. And so this is the drinking water source is the second criteria. So we gathered in the region where we're piloting this project. There's a lot of these is Ghana Water Company or existing pumps and boreholes and things like that. So this is what exists already in the area. We've got surface water on here as well. Roads. These are actually quite easy to categorize using satellite imagery or aerial imagery, and a combination of that plus the OpenStreetMap data. I don't know how many of you are familiar with OpenStreetMap. It's an open source collaborative effort to map everywhere in the world. And so they do rank the roads. Like this would be a poor quality road. This would be a motor feeder. It's got like some kind of decomposed, not granite, but some kind of covering. And then this is like what they call motor tarred, where it's actually got an impervious surface. So, and then the last thing is there's an amazing data set called, I think it's something like World Night Lights or something like that, but it shows which areas of the planet are like alive at night light. So, and then when you start to zoom in, you can see that it does in fact correlate with communities. It's not entirely perfect, but it's, because when you zoom in, it starts to get a little bit low resolution, but it really does help us figure out where there is power and where there is not power. So this is the interface that we have for app 1, the feasibility tool. So on the right, you'll see all of the communities went through that assessment, that feasibility assessment that they do, and this is the total number that they end up with, and then the priority ranking for that. And so when you click on any of these, it will zoom to the community hub, and then if you see over on the left, it's got the name of the community, it's got the contact of the government person there that they need to speak with, so they don't have to go looking up all of this stuff. It's all right here. It's got the broken down feasibility criteria, and then there's this area sort of middle right where they can actually edit these answers. And the reason why we need that is because this data is hard to find, and I'm sure they're going to come across what places where they're like oh, it said it had a market but it really doesn't, or it actually is served by a competitor. They're going to want to keep this updated, and so over here on the right is something called the medium-term development plan, and that's the thing that stipulates where adding water infrastructure is in a planning process of that local government. The local governments are district assemblies. And so they will have their priorities for their budget for that year. And so if they click on this link, it will do a pop-up where the whole plan will pop up in another browser window, so they don't have to look for that either. So, and as you can see in the editing area, there's all of the things that we talked about, the extra things on top of the main feasibility criteria. So we're going to give them the opportunity to spit out a summary report, and then the button in the middle where it says remove for field assessment, normally, because this has already been selected, if you see that up on the right, there's a checkbox next to the name of this pop-up window. So you can select them for field assessment or remove them if you change your mind about that. But the reason why we need to select these is so that this is a pre-screening tool, right? So it's the idea is to limit the number of places they actually have to visit, to only visit the top priority ones, the ones most likely to work for them. And so when they check that and have it available for field assessment, it makes it available in the mobile app so they can go do data collection. It makes these communities available in the next apps, as we'll see as we move along. So app number 2. And this actually is kind of the main theme of this presentation, even though I'll go over the other tools as well. But it is just such a complex thing to model that it deserves its own space. So why do we assess risk? Well, if current global patterns of increasing exposure, high levels of inequality, rapid urban development, and environmental degradation grow, then disaster risk may increase to dangerous levels. There were some numbers attached to that which were scary and stuff, but you get the idea. It's not going to get better unless we try and improve some things. So the global average annual loss is estimated to increase up to 415 billion by 2030. So those are the two reasons why we look at risk, right? There's loss of life and impact and cost. So so those are the things. So how do we assess risk? There's a lot of great frameworks and manuals that exist, but not many of them are digital or spatial tools. The ones that are available either display really coarse scale data that's like really more appropriate for regional, country level, or even global, or they only focus on one type of hazards. And there's a really good flood one, but that's all it looks at. So there's nothing super comprehensive. So we had to pull a couple of things together to make what we wanted. And so the Safe Water Resilience Toolkit is based on the Inform Risk Index from the Joint Research Center of European Commission. And it's translated into a geospatial app that's similar in concept to FEMA's Resilience Analysis and Planning Tool, RAPT. And you can look that up, you can play with it, you can see what that's like. But the data that we had to put into our model is appropriate for use at the subnational and local levels, and also contextually for Africa, because what indicates poverty here is not what indicates poverty there, and vice versa. It's kind of interesting. The team that we're working with on this project, they actually took the poverty assessment that was implemented in Ghana, and it made out that they were actually living way under the poverty level here, because they just don't translate the metrics that are used. It's kind of a really interesting experiment. So one of the main reason, you'll see these photos on the right. These are Safe Water Network's solar panels that got flooded. They got completely flooded out. This is the Volta Lake, and you can see how far in that flood came, and almost to the top of it in some areas. So they realized that they have do very limited evaluation of climate change or disaster risk metrics in their station design process. And obviously that really impacts the station operations. Like I said, these are the pictures from the flooding in the communities all along Lake Volta. And some of the ways infrastructure gets impacted is they have inability to access their control equipment. They have to pump for a lot longer. Their operations can be shut down for 1 to 2 months. So that makes an impact on their bottom line, and also the communities that don't get water at that time. It's a high impact expense wise on their maintenance reserves. having to relocate panels and cables, and then in other areas they have dry wells, so they have the opposite problem, drought. So all of these things, they lead to a high downtime of the system, low production volumes and water sales, and the high operational cost. So it really does impact them, and so they really wanted to start to try to integrate this kind of analysis into their programming. So what is risk? So there are some standardized ways of analyzing risk, and we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. So according to most of them, like the Inform model that you saw earlier, or the Sendai framework, which the UN has produced, they're all a similar idea. So according to the Interagency Task Force on Climate Change and Disaster Risk Reduction, risk equals hazards multiplied by vulnerability divided by capacity. And so, we're trying to build resilience in these communities. What is resilience? We need a definition of that. And I think this is probably one of the best ones I've read. The goal of a system to continue to function to the fullest possible extent in the face of stress to achieve its purpose. This is a function of both the vulnerability of the system and its adaptive capacity. So we want to address not just the hazard, but the level of vulnerability, and we want to build capacity to be able to build resilience. And I don't know if any of you have done any risk management or seen any risk assessments, but these kind of graphs are very, you'll see these everywhere. It's sort of the likelihood of it happening against the actual level of impact, basically. And so, yeah. So this is our Inform model, sort of broken down and simplified so you can see what data it includes. So we've got hazards and exposures. There's two different categories of those. There's human derived and there's natural and climate related. And what we look at really for this model, the most important thing is frequency. How often do these things happen? How often have they happened over the last 15, 20 years? You want a decent amount of time, but things change also, and populations grow so much, you can only go back so far really and have it be meaningful. So some of the things we looked at were conflict. That's always an issue there, the intensity of that and the risk of that. Flood frequency, drought frequency, earthquake frequency, wildfire, landslide, and disease. And when I say disease here, we just included water related, like waterborne illnesses, malaria, intestinal disease, that kind of thing, because we are focused on water for this particular exercise. That's not to say that this can't be adapted for other reasons. It's very applicable to most scenarios, whether you're doing water planning or environmental planning or anything. So, and then the second part of the model is vulnerability and impacts. And we've got three categories for that: socioeconomic, vulnerable groups, and water resource vulnerabilities. The water resource vulnerabilities was not in the original Inform model, but again, that's the theme of what we're looking at. So we wanted to add a couple of nuances where we know it impacts the bottom line in terms of resilience. So the data we've included in here is development and deprivation data, which is like the Human Development Index and the GDP, dependent males and dependent females. And what we mean by that is either children under 5 or elderly over 60 years old. Populations that live more than 2 kilometers from roads. That's actually another SDG, Sustainable Development Goal, that they want to have, I guess, essentially no populations living more than 2 kilometers from a road because it limits their access to services. Populations living in poverty, and then groundwater productivity and storage and depth to groundwater, where the vulnerability impacts for the water source vulnerabilities that we included. So in terms of adaptive capacity, we've got two categories: institutional, which is the governance aspect of things. Are they trustworthy? Do they put money into infrastructure, that kind of thing? And what infrastructure and services exist? So do they have access to improved housing, to roads less than 2 kilometers, access to healthcare, wash services, and electricity? So the other thing that we're adding beyond the informed model is the mitigation planning and activities. This is actually going to be a quantitative number that comes out of this model to say where they're at in terms of resilience and risk. And so if they go through the mitigation planning, that's obviously going to build adaptive capacity in terms of being able to mitigate the effects, right, of the hazards, especially against the vulnerable aspects. So therefore, that's a big component in the entire application. And you'll see as we go how that plays out. This is just a sample of some of the hazard risk outputs in Ghana. Like I said, we're starting in Ghana, and then who knows where next. But wildfire is pretty intense once you get north of Ashanti, which is this central region. But yeah, there are some areas they do a lot of like they do beekeeping, and then they smoke out some things. I forget what they do. It's agricultural related, but it does kick off a lot of wildfires. And then flooding is a big deal, and especially in certain areas. It's interesting. It's either riverine flooding, or if you know where the capital is, Accra down here, it's these urban areas, or Kumasi up here, are very, very frequently flooding. And that's due to the poor planning and the way that the impervious surface has been constructed around there. So, and then the drought, I included this. You'll see later I had to redo it. This is not correct, but it gives you sort of a visual idea of what the outputs are of the hazards. So this is the risk assessment tool. Is a complex subject that we tried to do a kind of at a glance type information. They don't want to become risk modeling experts. They just want the results. So, and they want to know what they can do to improve things. So that said, they've still got this community hub rank. As I said before, if it's been selected, it goes through to this tool. There may be an opportunity if they're going to put safe water infrastructure in a community. This is just a visual. We haven't decided on the mitigation rankings yet, but there's the opportunity to increase the resilience if they install water resources, because that's part of the adaptive capacity, right? That's access to wash services. So they'll have, and then we eventually, we'll have this all calculated, and they'll get a true resilience score of this community. So each time they zoom to a community, all this data will change based on what it's like in that particular community hub. As you can see, it's just got a light summary of all of the things, and everything's categorized with risk. It's low to moderate, moderate to high, or high. Those, or severe. Those are the 5 categories for everything, and it will be the same for the vulnerability and impacts and the adaptive capacity. I'll show you some of that data later. So this is app number 3. This is the EPANET tool. This is something that, so the tool that people have been using that is free and open source for network planning is, as I said, it's EPANET, but it's a desktop application and it has no spatial reference in it, and you can't design over imagery, and you can't, when you export that, it won't land on a map, if that makes sense. So as you can see, when we started putting some of their networks in here, it's going through buildings, it's going all around. The point of building this tool here was 2 or 3-fold. One, so that they could design in real space and actually see what they're designing through and over. So satellite imagery is really important. And also the ability for the whole team to see the network, because if you're not in the construction team over there and you're not doing the design of this, you'll never see it. It's as simple as that. Like, you'll see it being installed, but you'll never have access to it. So, it's when you have WebGIS, it's just really powerful to keep teams on the same tool. And one thing I should say about our platform is that we can actually make our web tools work offline. They won't sync until you go back online again, but if you get the thing loaded up, you can undock it and work offline, which is really important in some of these low resource areas. And we have a mobile app too, and that obviously also has to work offline. So you can see that the summary of the risk assessment is carried through, so that when they're designing here, they have access to that. I don't have the data shown visually in here, but they can design knowing what is going on in this community. If this were a big, huge flood area, they might want to move it over a little bit, or do some kind of sandbagging mitigation, which you'll see in the next tool. But yeah, I've had some engineers beta test this because it is an engineering tool, and I'm not an engineer, so I wanted to make sure that it was running as an engineer would use it. And then it spits out the reports, as you can see there. So, and again, it will show you what was improved from before by inputting this this system. You know, the edit options will pop up, like the hydraulic options and other options, and then the simulation will actually run it and give you the reports right here. So the mitigation tool. So this is a very, very recent thing that we've started mocking up and talking about. Nothing's been built for this one yet. The other ones all have some level of completeness. The Ethernet one is finished and the feasibility is finished. But yeah, this one is brand new. And so what we're going to have to do is look at different potential mitigations that they can perform on different system components. A big deal is having the power supply, having backup generators and things like that, and supply chain. Can they get repair materials in and out if there's flooding or some earthquake or some other thing, or do they have enough stashed locally that they have access to those things? Things like that. That's the kind of practical planning ahead. Test that generator in every 6 months. So who's responsible for that? And when are they going to start doing it, and how often? So then they will get a notification, a text message or an email that reminds that person who's responsible that, hey, it's time to check if the generators are working okay, and make sure that we've got enough fuel for them for a certain amount of time. And then that plan will be printable. Again, everything's done still in the context of, in that community, what are the main risks and vulnerabilities, because you still need to know that when you're going through these. If say drought is low in this particular place, for instance, then you may only do a couple of things on this tab. So each tab will have a different interface, just like this, the same kind of layout. So it's really a management tool. It's a wizard, essentially, to help them go and create a plan for how to address mitigation. And last but not least is the field sales tool. This is actually a project that we started with Safe Water Network. And actually, one thing I probably should say, Safe Water Network, great organization. They were actually started by the actor Paul Newman. And, you know, it's kept going, and it's a very successful, you know, they come at things in a very different angle with a business model and everything. And they are just so great to work with. And I've learned a lot from them. We started out with this sales tool, and they really knew what they wanted. They knew what data they wanted to collect. There's a payment process, there's an installation schedule, and they want to record issues for customer service too. And then recently we've got our mobile app. This is the interface for that here. It's got these like concertina where it opens the different sections, which I really like. And then this system, they can go and interview potential customers, find out like if they're willing to pay for a household connection, a pipes connection to their house. That's what they focus on now. There's no more like just pumps for the community. They're really looking to professionalize the infrastructure. So we've got actual invoices and receipts that spit out of this, and then they can track sales parameters also. So so that's that. Future plans for the project. So in a few months, up to a year, we're going to scale up. Once we get the funding for that, we'll be actively looking for funding, I would say probably in the next 5 or 6 months. And we hope to scale up the geographic area, because we work with a lot of other safe water enterprises that work in different regions and different areas. So the native mobile app is being actually literally released in a few days. So it's working great. It looks great. Works for Android and iOS. And one thing I should mention is our entire system is open source because we've got to keep the costs down. So the subscriptions for these guys is very minimal, so that we can keep it sustainable. And we want to also make it free for local governments. So anywhere that they work, local governments will also have access to the tools so that they can see what's going on in their community. And we have had some interest in local governments having a platform like this, so that they can manage their planning projects too. So last but not least, I wanted to do a demo. This is desktop GIS demo that I'm going to do. Let's see, I got to get out of this. Just give me 1 second. Okay, so I wanted to show you a little bit more about how the data was generated from the model. And the flood one is a really good one to do that with. You saw the photos of the flooding of the those solar panels that were half underwater. And so these dots represent Safe Water Network's water infrastructure. And so if we think about the different parts of the model, the first part was the hazards and exposures, excuse me. And so the flood hazard in the Volta region, an eastern region, which is here, it shows you where the high risk areas are and the low risk areas are. And I will show you exactly where those flooded solar panels were. They were here, and they were also, was it this one? I think they were right here as well. So it actually came beyond what we would normally predict. I mean, this is showing a lower, slightly lower risk, low moderate, I would say. Whoops. Oh, it wasn't that one. But this one, it was definitely in a higher risk area. It's more up to the like the moderate high. So so yeah, it definitely happened. And it's really nice when you get confirmation on your data like that, because I said, hey, Joe, who's the guy from I've been working with on this with Safe Water Network, I said, can you send me information about where your flooding happened? And so I was pleased to get these and see that, okay, the data's truthing, it's ground truthed. And you always want that, because part of the issue with GIS sometimes is, are you modeling reality? It's got to, especially for things like this, it's got to reflect what's on the ground, even in an area where the data can be minimal, But if it doesn't, then people are making decisions based on inaccurate data. It's a challenge for sure, but I like to ground truth whenever it's possible, and that way you get to understand where the good data sets are and what's really representing things. So that's another thing, is good data sources. Vulnerabilities and impacts. So vulnerable populations. You always, when you see hazards, you always want to see where the settlements are. So these gray areas are where the settlements are. And as you can see right here, there's a settlement all around there that was also flooded. There's a settlement right here. There's a lot. They obviously, it's a resource, right? Water is a resource, so people do tend to congregate around the rivers and the lakes and things like that. So so you want to be able to quantify that, like who is at risk and by how much. The other things we had in our model were poor road access. So if you look at all the darker areas are areas of larger area without access to roads. So the lighter the color, the less vulnerable, and the darker the color, the more vulnerable. I tried to be thematic with the colors, like the middle of the model is blue, the hazards are red, the middle of the model is blue, and the adaptive capacity is green. So I've kind of gone with that in my breakdown of data here. If we look at populations under the poverty level, what is this data not showing up? Just took a while. So, hello? Sorry, I thought I had somebody speaking. This data is not the most ideal in resolution, but one of the things is data is just getting better and better and more automated. And so, this will be updated as soon as the data improves, but it gives us an idea of, where the more vulnerable populations may be, and a lot of them are along this this side of the river where those places flooded. So it's definitely something to note. Vulnerable males. Is this showing? Oh yeah, there it is. So not a ton of vulnerable males living here. It's fairly low, moderate vulnerability. Let's see, and then females, a little bit more. So we've got, somewhat of a higher population of girls that are vulnerable than boys, but it's not like masses. So, but again, that just is part of something that goes into the calculation. So it's part of the model. All right, so now we're going to look at groundwater vulnerability. So depth to groundwater, and again, you can see this is very coarse resolution, but this is produced by the British Geological Society, and it's the Africa groundwater map, and it is the best data that we have right now for mapping groundwater, unless it's done by experts at the local level. So I'm assuming, because it's such a huge project that they're working on, that this is going to improve also, but it gives us an idea of, you've got a high flood area and high groundwater levels, it's going to flood. So when you look at combined things like that, it's interesting. So groundwater storage, again, high groundwater storage plus high groundwater levels plus flooding, it's going to flood. So, and then also how productive is the groundwater, like how the recharge rate. That's a little better here, but close by is fairly high groundwater recharge. Apologies. Need more caffeine, I think, at this point of the day. And then what else didn't we look at? Development and deprivation. This is the last thing in the vulnerabilities and impacts category of the model. So, oh, I need to turn this off to avoid confusion. So GDP and Human Development Index. So in this particular area, moderate vulnerability. So it's what you would expect in a community like this. And then low income and unimproved housing. So, there is some moderate high vulnerability areas, mostly moderate, which you would expect given the outcome of the other data. So the last category is adaptive capacity. So access to healthcare. So one of the things, we don't like just doing buffers because it's not very realistic for real life. If you live over here, you're not going to walk across the wilderness and maybe up a giant hill to get to a healthcare facility. So we've actually done access via roads, whether they're lower class roads or covered roads, doesn't matter. We've just integrated that as being a more reasonable way to calculate access to healthcare. So as you can see around these center areas, that's a higher capacity, and then the lighter color it goes, it's a lower capacity. So all of these open areas are a lower capacity in terms of access to healthcare. Oh, we only have 10 minutes left. I gotta keep an eye on the time here. Sorry, you can stop me, Cassie, too, if you need to.
Well, I wanted to ask a question, and I know I'm breaking the rules here because we're going to get to the end, but I was just curious, as you're talking about, vulnerable communities, and this may be perhaps outside the scope of the application, but any thoughts about building in like notification or any type of text, in places that can receive information when there are hazards that are noticeable in vulnerable communities?
Funny you should ask that. We've just started talking about maybe doing a crowdsourcing app, so that, because most people have mobile phones over there. It's really funny. They could be living in extreme poverty, and then they can still get WhatsApp messages and chats and all that kind of stuff. So yes, and in another place we work, they use a lot of radio stuff too, because radio is huge over there. But yeah, if that's what you're meaning, like people can self-report that there's an incident, is that the kind of thing that you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, then it would be then the question is, who does it go to? Because not all of the locations are very well equipped they may have a disaster management program, but no, like one staff person to implement it, so
Right.
we should talk about that on a bigger level in terms of like, who would it be the best to send this out to? Would it be a blast to multiple organizations? I know they do stuff like that in Asia where they have like severe like tornadoes and things like that. So definitely an option. So yeah. Okay, I've only got like these to go through and then we can just do questions. So there's the access to improved housing, which again, not very good resolution. Access to improved water sources. This is actually a pretty good area. So it includes not just Safe Water Networks infrastructure, but other groups as well. Open defecation free. It's not something that's lovely to talk about, but it is important, especially when you want water that's not tainted with anything. So access to sanitation. It's pretty good in this area. You might not want to go north of the river, I guess. Access to roads. It's sort of the opposite of what we saw before, but it's got pretty good coverage in this area. And then access to electricity. And you'll see, this is the edge of Accra, so big city. And then you'll see that they kind of come in lines. We also have the utility data, so we can lay the lines over and see that they match. It's really cool how the satellite imagery just tells the story and it reflects what's going on. So anyway, that is the end of my flood demo. So we should probably, if there's any questions.
Yeah, that was wonderful. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, so I'm going to open up the floor to folks that may have questions. I'm going to grab the sharing capability here.
Yeah, I'll stop.
So thoughts, comments, ideas that you may have that you would like to ask Amanda. This would be your opportunity to do so. Is there any questions out there? And feel free again to unmute yourself and introduce yourself.
Hi, Amanda. This is Diana.
Hi, Diana.
Thank you for the presentation. This is sort of going back to the beginning. It's a little bit tangential, but you mentioned in the beginning in terms of getting the demographic information for the communities. Yep. You said something about Facebook having some of those demographics.
Relative wealth data is something that they're working on. So then there's a calculation that you can do to get absolute relative wealth. No, not relative, absolute wealth as opposed to relative wealth. But they need to refine it a little bit more because it's too coarse.
Interesting. Right. Okay, and they're like scraping that from people's Facebook accounts, I'm assuming?
They're doing a combination of, most of these are modeling a combination of data, and then they might use certain machine learning processes and things like that to try to refine it. But this, I believe, is a model that's based on like actual census data plus data scraped from cell phones and things like that. It's not just Facebook, but it's like the data that phones put out there, which is super, super handy when you have like refugees and things like that. You can kind of do a lot of assessments with that kind of data. So
yeah. Oh, interesting. Okay. And yeah. I guess going off that, like with the mobile data, is there any I guess just thinking about like trying to figure out where people are or where consultations are or where people travel frequently or something like that to kind of put them, put water supplies in common locations. Is there any more like specific impact of that data on the project?
Not right now. The other project I was working on had some use some of that. We got this guy, there's a organization called NetCentric, and what they do is like grassroots organization within communities. And so they thought, we'll try it here and see what happens, because they were finding that people had just stopped caring. They had stopped caring that the water points were broken because no one fixed them, even if they reported it. So to get them to care and to get this customer service thing going, we started using cell phone data. Where are the places where people are gathering? Where are the important places where people meet to talk? Because there's a lot of tribal groups still. And so they did use some data for that and for that purpose. But it is a good idea, actually. We were talking about doing maybe crowdsourcing so that people can, self-report. But and and then the benefit of that is that the safe water enterprises would know where the demand is, right, and get some idea of their ability to pay. But yeah, I think it could be good to have a combination of the two things, just to kind of see how, because the people who work in agriculture are constantly moving around, so so it could be helpful.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Thanks, Amanda.
You're welcome.
Great question. So Zachary in the chat window, he is asking if there's any plans for 3D modeling using NASA's SRTM data as a visualization tool. Is there a need for that at this particular version or level?
Maybe not yet, but I'm glad you brought that up, because that's a data set that we do use for elevation stuff and some of that modeling. But I think at some point we're going to want that in the EPANET tool, and the reason being is you do not want to build water systems down from sanitation systems, because if you flood, then yuck, so we need to have part of the professional engineering toolkit, in a way, is to have elevation data. It's important, and so we at minimum, like you said, as a visualization tool, at minimum they can at least see what's uphill and downhill from. I don't know if we'll get into cross sections or anything like that, but yeah, no, that's a good question.
Okay, so I think this is probably the last question of the night, unless there's anyone else that has a question out there. Is there anyone that would like to jump in? Okay, last big question. So you've received a multi-billion-dollar grant. What's the sky's the limits here for what you want to do? I know you're very passionate with this kind of toolkit, and you've spent a lot of time coming up with the best solutions, but you have unlimited resources financially. What's the next step?
Yeah, I thought you were telling me I was getting that then. I got
I'm
really
sorry.
excited.
I know. I was like, oh boy.
That's funny.
I wish. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, right. No, that's okay. I would want to make sure that the tool is available, that we know who all of the Safe Water Enterprise groups are. I think I would want to make sure that all the data in those places are available, so the tool is available to them. We want to make it more customized so that people can everybody's going to have a slightly different feasibility process, right? So we've got to make it a little bit more flexible for other groups to do the different kind of analysis. I would want to expand it beyond just water. I think we need to start doing environmental as well as water. We can't just keep things in a box, right? It all affects everything. So I think I'd start there, but it can be applicable to everything. It's just that we happen to be working with Safe Water Enterprises, and it's a really good model to solve a big problem.
Excellent. Well, this was so great. Thank you so much. I honestly think you're a true GIS MacGyver, in that, even just looking at the different levels of resolution in the data that you were sharing and able to make it work for you, and the desired outcomes of what you were asking, I think is just a wonderful example for folks attending this session. So if we could just go ahead and give everyone a virtual round of applause. Thank you, Amanda, so much. And
you're very welcome.
So I just want to go ahead and remind everyone that we're back at full in swing in action with GIS After Dark. So our next one, go ahead and mark your calendars for November 4th. We have two folks from NAPSIG, which is the National Alliance for Public Safety GIS Foundation. And so they're going to be sharing with us how they're using and training the next generation of emergency disaster response GIS folks. So with that said, folks, I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. Amanda, thank you so much for sharing your amazing work with the group. And have a safe and healthy week and a wonderful weekend. Thank you, folks.
Bye.
Bye.